Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for the invitation and the possibilities to speak here. And thank you for everybody who's still here with us. So I only see Daniel, but I guess there are more people listening. And I enjoyed the talks of this afternoon a lot, but I will not directly continue the kind of analysis that have been presented before, because I will raise a rather general and abstract question. That is the question for the possibility of non-violent political action. So my question is non-violent political action possible? And I will do this by following in several steps what Walter Benjamin in his essay, which in a sense is the occasion of our conference, has presented. So if we follow these reflections by Walter Benjamin in his critique of violence, the answer to the question, is non-violent political action possible, is obviously positive. Yes, he says, there is non-violent political action, namely insofar as its means are pure, rein, which is, I think, often translated as unalloyed. We can see what this means, namely that what a pure means is or are, by looking at relationship, as Benjamin says, between private persons, which are, as he says, full of examples of this. Here, Benjamin writes, non-violent agreement. So here he means in the field of private relations, non-violent agreement is possible wherever a civilized outlook, in German it's much more poetic, die Kultur des Herzens. So wherever a civilized outlook allows the use of pure means of agreement, courtesy, sympathy, peaceableness, trust, and whatever else might here be mentioned are their subjective preconditions, unquote. Their analogy in the political field is the art of diplomacy, whose task is, I quote again, to resolve conflicts case by case in the names of their states peacefully and without contracts, unquote. In all these cases, and I skip here the most interesting case, namely the proletarian general strike, which Benjamin quite astonishingly includes in this list, that, of Kultur der Herzen and diplomacy, we have to do with forms of action that aim at the non-violent resolution of conflict. Its condition is what Benjamin calls Sachlichkeit, objectivity. A little bit longer quote, unalloyed, pure, non-violent means are never those of direct, but always that of indirect solutions. They therefore never apply directly to the resolution of conflict between man and man, Mensch und Mensch in German, but only to matters concerning objects, Güter. The sphere of non-violent means opens up in the realm of conflicts relating in the most objective way to goods, unquote. So the condition of possibility, Benjamin claims, of political non-violence is Sachlichkeit, objectivity, which in turn is only possible in the relation to goods, Güter. Now, however, insofar as political struggles are struggles about power, about domination and freedom or liberation, they are not such conflicts. They're not conflicts about goods. The question, is non-violent political action possible, has therefore to be asked again. The affirmative answer with respect to conflict resolution does not help us. Because, as I said, these struggles of which I think we should speak, and we did speak the whole afternoon, which are struggles about domination and liberation or domination of freedom, are precisely not conflicts about goods and cannot be objectified, cannot be sachlich. The distinction that the critique of violence develops in this field, the field of political struggle, is thus another one. It's not the distinction between violence and non-violence, but rather between different kinds of violence. Instead of asking, is non-violent political action possible, Benjamin raises the other question for a different kind of violence, as he says, a violence that is not a means, be it pure or impure, at all anymore. Now, before I can try to determine this different kind of violence, what this different kind of violence could mean, I have to say what I understand by violence, violence in all of its kinds. The definition of violence with which I work here, I mean, it's not even a definition, it's simple. Violence or violent, I want to say, is a specific type of impact or effect that one has on some other. This way of affecting the other is violent if it violates, if it injures, hurts, or infringes the other. The simple definition is violence violates. The violence of the one violates the other. All violence does lead to some kind of suffering. Now, the violation that violence effects can be understood as either in an objective or in a subjective sense. Objectively defined, an act of violation is the external disruption of the wholeness of a form, the infringement of its integrity. The objective definition of violence presupposes thus the idea of a given form that is defined by its teleology, say the integrity of a living body, or of the psyche or the mind of someone else. To act violently on that form means to externally disrupt its self-forming activity by which it realizes its telos or its essence. The subjective definition of violence does without and away with such objectively determinate essences or teloi. Subjectively defined, violence consists in harming or constraining someone else's self-determination. Here, in the subjective understanding of violence, the criterion of violence is accordingly the other's will. To inflict violence on some other means, in the subjective sense, to act against her will, to violate the other's power of self-determination. Now, with this rough determination of violence and violation, we can now ask again for if and why and how political action is to be violent or can be non-violent. Or in Benjamin's terms, we can ask which kinds of violence, which kinds of violating the integrity or the self-determination of some other have to be distinguished by a critique of violence. Because, I mean, the literal meaning here of critique of violence is to distinguish between different kinds of violence and say that there are some kinds which are reprehensible and have to be refuted, but others which are not only necessary, but maybe even good. On the other hand, on the one hand, there's the kind of violence that Benjamin identifies with law. That law exerts or threatens to exert violence is obvious and undisputed. Nobody denies it. The ideologies of law that Benjamin criticizes legitimize such violence in instrumental terms. Accordingly, the violence of law is legitimate because it is merely a means. This is the fundamental mistake of those legal ideologies. For the violence of law is, this is Benjamin's claim, is not a means, however just its purpose. Or the violence of law that truly calls for a critique does not consist in its means, not in the fact that law too constrains, threatens, and violates. Rather, the violence of law is violence, as Benjamin says, crowned by fate. That is to say, the violence of law consists in its operating as or like fate. And now I quote something, I think a quote that to which Daniel in his introduction already referred, which I think puts this quite clearly. Benjamin says, therefore, the function of violence in lawmaking is twofold. In the sense that lawmaking pursues as its end, with violence as the means, what is to be established as law. But at the moment of instatement does not dismiss violence. Rather, at this very moment of lawmaking, it specifically establishes as law not an end unalloyed by violence, but one necessarily and intimately bound to it under the title of power. Lawmaking is power making, assumption of power, and to that extent, an immediate manifestation of violence. Unquote. So it is not the fact that law is applied and enforced by violent means, not the fact that law uses violence as a means that is the problem of law. and of the legitimation of its violence. Rather, it is the fact that the violence in law cannot remain a mere means, that it does not abdicate, as Hannah Arendt has put it, and instead becomes the mode of being or the mode of operation of law itself. So law does not use violence, but law rather is violence, that is the problem. The violence of law, which Benjamin calls fateful for this reason, consists in the fact that law's violent means obliterates its just purpose because its self-preservation becomes its only purpose. Law is merely about power. It is about its own power, the power of law. The fateful violence of law is the violence of its self-preservation. That, Benjamin argues, is what makes the violence of law reprehensible. Not that law too threatens, violent, and coerces, but that law operates for its own sake, for the sake of the preservation of its order, the establishment and enforcement of its categories, perspective, and language, for the sake of its own power. Like in fate, such an operation that is about the power to operate is cursed to continue forever. Due to its circular, fateful character and temporality, this first kind of violence, the violence of law, is called mythic violence. It is mythic because it is not an instrument or means, but rather a manifestation, says Benjamin. Violence as the manifestation of an order, or more precisely, of its power, of the order as power. The preservation of the order is not the goal of the violent act, it is the violent act, in which therefore the establishment and preservation of the order become indistinguishable. The first kind of non-instrumental violence is thus the violence of power, or more precisely of ruling power, of the power of domination. It is violence not as the non-instrumental, it is violence as the non-instrumental manifestation of a dominating power over its subjects. And this means the other way around, that domination always exceeds the instrumental or economic logic of expropriation, appropriation, exploitation, enrichment of profit. Power as in domination is circular, self-referential, not instrumental. It expresses itself by violence. One could say power is about the joy of violation. Now, the project of a critique of violence is not just to expose the falsity of such violence of power manifestation. The project of a critique of violence is also, and more importantly, to distinguish this mythic, reprehensible kind of non-instrumental violence from, as Benjamin said, I quoted this in the beginning, a different kind of violence, which is also non-instrumental or immediate, as Benjamin says, but in an entirely different way, which Benjamin calls, to mark its opposition to mythical violence in the most dramatic way, divine. Benjamin describes this critical, i.e. decisive difference between the two kinds of non-instrumental violence by saying, and we already heard this before, but while the first one is law-making, the second one is law-destroying or law-annihilating. The former sets boundaries, the latter boundlessly destroys them. The first one brings at once guilt and retribution, the second only expiates it. We've already seen what Benjamin means when he calls the first kind of non-instrumental violence mythic and lawmaking. It means that it is the power of domination. Violence not, as I said before, the instrument of power, but rather its manifestation or expression, its mode of being. From this follows that the other or different kind of immediate non-instrumental violence is the violence of the annihilation of power. The other kind of violence is the annihilation of power, and this means also the other way around, that the annihilation of power, any annihilation of power, is violence. To annihilate a ruling power is an act of liberation, which Benjamin calls Entsetzung. This liberating, emancipatory annihilation of power, Benjamin claims, is not accidentally and even less instrumentally, but rather essentially violent and violating. If political action is an act or the act of liberation, political action is, and it has to be, an act of violation. I think this is what Benjamin claims. Now I want to say some brief words about why this is a good idea. Now, why is this so? The question can be answered if we follow a pretty enigmatic hint that Benjamin gives at some point when he speaks of educative power, educatory power, erzieherische Gewalt, as that sanctioned manifestation of the different kind of violence, namely divine violence, that we can still find in present-day life. But why is education violent in this sense? It is so to the extent it is justifiable to call this violence the educative power, the violence of educative power, or the educative violence, too annihilating. Like the other forms of divine violence, it annihilates, however, only as, and this is not, of course, not very important, it annihilates only relatively with regard to goods, right, life, and such like, never absolutely with regard to the soul of the living, Benjamin says. Education is thus relatively annihilating or violent because it is absolutely affirmative or productive. What education affirms or brings about is what Benjamin calls the soul. What is a soul? I suggest not to understand this term here in the sense of Aristotle as a psyche, the inner principle or arche, the always already existing ground and beginning of a living being. We rather should understand Benjamin's Seele, soul, in the sense of Franz Rosenzweig as an effect. So the soul is not always already there and is the inner principle driving a living being, but the soul is an effect in Rosenzweig. Namely, the effect of a revelation confronting and transforming the self from outside. The self, das Selbst, Rosenzweig says, becomes soul by a revelatory experience and transformation. And this becoming soul is what Rosenzweig calls liberation. So education is about liberating the soul from the self. Thus, the self is or has not yet a soul when education, namely that education which is liberation, starts. The self is rather herself. The self is rather him or herself, namely determined by a natural or social or cultural identity. Identities in this sense are the effects, the seed and the instrument of power. By liberating the soul of or from the self, the educatory process is thus the manifestation of a law of power annihilating violence. It annihilates identities and therefore it annihilates power, because power is practiced by constructing identities. It violates the identity of the self, it destroys her or his integrity, wholeness, and self-determination. But it's crucial to note that herein, the violation again does not function as a means. The violent annihilation of identity is not instrumental. This violence is rather a manifestation, the manifestation of the becoming of the soul, hence of its liberation. No, we could say such education is not by itself a political act. So what follows from this example of divine or pure unmediated violence, the example of educatory violence, for the question whether, and if so why, political action cannot be non-violent. Let me take as an example the act of addressing someone, of representing her, the act of representation, which I take to be a political act. Is there, following Benjamin's argument, non-violent representation of the other possible? One can understand this question in the sense I want only briefly to mention this here, discussed by Jacques Derrida in his critique of Levinas. Derrida understands it here as the question whether non-violent representation is possible, and he answers the question by claiming that violence is transcendental. It is a condition of possibility of representing anyone or even anything at all. Representation, Derrida claims here, as such is violent. So that according to Derrida, the alternative is not between violent or non-violent, but rather between a more or less violent representation. But I want to ask the question here in a different sense, not by asking if political representation can be, but rather if it should be non-violent. If it should aim at non-violence. If the commitment to non-violence as such defines the goodness or justice of representation. Now, on the basis of what I've said before about educative violence, it is clear what the problem, indeed the danger of such a definition is or were. It lies in the fact that it absolutizes non-violation. As I said in the beginning, acts of violation can either objectively understood injure the integrity of another's form or subjectively understood harm her will. They are either infringements of the other's teleology or of her self-determination. To claim that any representation that is violent in either sense is thereby, merely by being violent, unjust, thus either presupposes that any given form or that any given act of self-determination is simply by being given legitimate, untouchable. It either presupposes natural goodness of forms or natural freedom of the will. It presupposes that a self-determination, simply because an act of self-determination is thereby already a free act, which should not be changed and in which we should not intervene from outside. But that what is naturally given is neither good nor free. The analysis of educative violence shows or indicates why. It is because that which is given by first or second nature is precisely not the liberated soul, but rather a condition of identity and hence an effect of domination. It is therefore wrong to say, this is at least what I want to suggest, that a just representation of the other must reflect, i.e. merely duplicate her form or her will. It is wrong to say that that representation of the other is just, which corresponds to her self-representation. For in the simple, given, uneducated form, our self-representations are always false. They, that is, we ourselves, are unjust to ourselves. To commit political representation to adopting and duplicating the other self-representation is therefore to repeat and thus entrench its injustice. Therefore, the political acts of representation must be violent. There must be a manifestation of the violence that annihilates law, order, and form, and liberates the soul from identity. Such violence, I want to claim, is the virtue of political action. Thank you.